Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center Designing for Pedestrian Safety webinar series. Today is the 7th webinar of this 8-part series. Today's webinar is entitled Road Diets with Peter Lagerwey, Regional Office Director with Toole Design Group. My name is David Anderson, and I am the PBIC Communications Coordinator. I'll be facilitating today's webinar. I'd first like to say hello to our speaker to make sure he's ready and everyone can hear him. Peter, are you there?
I'm here.
All right. Yeah, just wanted to make sure we just wanted to make sure we had you on the line.
Great.
All right, thank you. Attendees, if you can hear me and if you can hear Peter, click the hand in the box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen to raise your hand so that we can be sure our audience can hear us. All right, and it looks like hands are going up. Great. Before we get started with today's webinar, I want to go over a few administrative details and the functionality of the webinar software. If for some reason your computer or web browser freezes during the webinar, please reload the website and log back into the program. You'll be able to rejoin the session. Please note that attendees will not be able to speak during the webinar. We do expect a large number of attendees on this call, so by muting your audio, it helps us to cut down on confusion and background noise. As an attendee, you have a control box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen that collapses and expands by clicking the double arrows. Though you won't be able to speak, you will have the ability to ask questions by entering them in the question box. If you have a problem during the webinar, you may enter it here. I'll monitor these questions and respond to you if I'm able. Questions pertaining to the presentation may be asked at any time in the question box, but will not be addressed until the end of the program, and we have built in about 20 minutes for our discussion period. Please feel free to ask those questions as we go along, and we'll get to them after the presentation. Also, when you exit the webinar, there is a very brief survey that will pop up. We would very much appreciate your feedback on our performance. Following today's webinar, you will receive a follow-up email. This email will be sent 1 to 2 days after the presentation and will include a link to download a printable certificate of attendance for 1.5 hours of instruction. If there are multiple attendees at your site, please forward this link to other participants so that they can download and print the certificate with their name. Before we get started with today's program, I want to give everyone a little information about this webinar series. The goal of the Designing for Pedestrian Safety webinar series is intended to help communities address pedestrian safety issues through design and engineering solutions. Modeled after the Federal Highway Administration and PBIC's in-person training course, Designing for Pedestrian Safety, this free webinar series will cover topics ranging from sidewalk design to road diets. The final webinar in this series has not been scheduled, but is tentatively slated for the last week of November. Once this date has been set, we will send out a notice via email to our PBIC email list. The 8-part series was developed by the Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center, a national clearinghouse of pedestrian and bicycle-related safety information and resources. We offer information and technical assistance to diverse audiences about health and safety, engineering, advocacy, education, enforcement, access, and mobility as it relates to pedestrians and bicycles. The PBIC and today's webinar are both made possible with funding from the U.S. Department of Transportation, Federal Highway Administration. Today's session will be archived and available for download on our website at www.walkinginfo.org/webinars. In addition to these webinars, PBIC offers 4 different in-person training courses to provide technical assistance to professionals and community members in developing pedestrian safety action plans and improving conditions for walking. These courses can be found at walkinginfo.org/training. Now I'm going to turn the screen over to Peter for the feature presentation, Road Diets. While he's getting set up with his slide presentation, I want to take a quick poll from the audience. Please let us know how many participants are viewing the webinar at your site. Okay, and I'm going to give everyone a few more seconds to answer that polling question. Great. I want to thank everyone for answering that question. Now we'll have our speaker tell us a little bit about himself. Peter, would you mind telling the audience a little bit about your background?
Sure. My name is Pete Lagerwey, and I'm with Toole Design Group. And I've been here with Toole Design Group a little over a year. Before that, I was the Pedestrian and Bicycle Program Coordinator with the City of Seattle for about 25 years. And while I was there, I also Did a lot of consulting around the country. I think I've been to about 200 different communities over the years, and mostly teaching courses. I think just two things probably are germane here. One is that the city of Seattle has done about 30 road diets now, and they continue to do them. I was involved in a lot of them. So what we're going to cover today is based in some real experience, and related to that is all the things you're going to see and that we're going to talk about are things I've had the opportunity to be involved in actually putting on the ground. So hopefully that practical sort of get the dirt under your fingernails kind of experience will also be useful in terms of the discussion and the questions.
Thank you, Peter. We will take questions at the end. Peter, please take it from here.
Okay. And if you could let me know, is my screen up?
Yes, we can see your screen, and you are all good to go.
Okay, thank you. I'd just like to start out by just a couple introductory remarks. First of all, the concept of road diets is really one of my favorite topics to talk about, and really one of the most exciting tools that we have available to make improvements for bicyclists, make improvements for pedestrians, and also really revitalize communities. This is more than just something for bikes and peds. This is really energizing the street. It's economic development. It's really a way that we can sort of reclaim and re-energize, re-peopleize our streets. And the good news is this, is that literally every community in America has many, many opportunities to do road diets. This is not limited to just Seattle or any other place that I've worked. Every community that I've ever gone into, I've come across multiple opportunities to do a road diet. One of the things that I like to do is sort of think of this as how do we divvy up a scarce urban resource? A scarce urban resource is our street right-of-ways. We have a lot of competition for that space. It starts with general purpose lanes, bus lanes, bike lanes, turning lanes, parking, sidewalks, buffers for sidewalks, street plantings, cafes, all sorts of things that we like to do in our street right-of-way. And one of the ways to look at planning is to say, how do we divvy up this scarce urban resource? And my focus today is to say that one of the things that we should be looking at is doing road diets, because this is something that benefits everyone, including motor vehicles. So the learning objectives, some things that we're going to be going through today is, first of all, to be able to describe how pedestrian crash risk increases with the number of travel lanes and speed. And, of course, the inverse of that is how pedestrian crash, the risk is reduced when you reduce the number of lanes, and how speed is reduced when you reduce the number of lanes. The next learning objective is to explain why reducing the number of lanes reduces risk and makes it easier to cross the road. And I'll spend a fair amount of time talking about how this benefits pedestrians. By the way, a lot of road diets are generated through pedestrian concerns, issues related to economic development, and I'll get into that a little bit more. And sometimes it's driven by the need to put in bike lanes, but not always. There's so many good reasons to do road diets, and sometimes actually the bike lanes are almost incidental to other bigger factors in communities of why people do this. It's not to minimize the bike lanes, it's just to suggest that there's a lot of different ways to sort of get to the decision to do a road diet. I also want to demonstrate how reducing the lanes feels free space for higher and better use. And one of the concepts I'm going to introduce here, too, in terms of use is total road counts. In other words, are we building roads to just count motor vehicles, or are we going to count people? And one way to look at that is when a bus has 30 people in it, does that count as 30, or does it count as one vehicle? And I think if we start looking at counting people and not just motor vehicles, I mean, in the end of the day, what is the road for? It's to serve, all of us. I think it'll really change how we start looking at this. And then finally, streets exist 24/7. Peak traffic may be a concern for as little as 30 minutes a day. And one of the concepts that, and I'm not going to circle back to this too much, but I think it's important to remember is when you start looking at traffic volumes, when you start looking at level of service, when you start looking at capacity, are you building to peak traffic? And if you build to peak traffic, and that's we do that a lot of times, then you're going to have excess capacity. And quite often that peak traffic may be as little as 30 minutes a day. But the good news is here, of course, is that because we've built the peak traffic so often, we have a lot of streets with excess capacity, which is now giving us the opportunity to do road diets because we really have overbuilt in many cases. So the classic road diet, and you can see the picture here, is on the left, 4 lanes, 2 lanes in each direction. And this is Street Anywhere USA. You can find this street, a similar street, any place in the United States. And going over to the right is going from 4 lanes to 3 lanes. And you can see the change there where instead of 2 lanes in each direction, there's only 1 lane in each direction with a center turn lane and the bike lanes added. So that's sort of your classic road diet, but I'm also going to show you some other examples of different kinds of road diets, including one on a one-way street. So road diets, we claim a street for a lot of different uses. This happens to be in Seattle. In fact, I was on the street this morning. It's less than a mile from my house. And there was an opportunity here to redo the street. And by the way, just as an aside, one of the things that we always look for in terms of opportunities to make changes to the street system is there a possibility of tying it to another project. And you'll see the newer looking concrete in the center of the street here, and that was because there was a huge sewer line that went down the center of the street. And so as part of reconstructing the street, the median was added. You can see that there. The center turn lane, the on-street parking had a little more space. And further up the street, there were bike lanes installed. Since this picture's taken, the bike lanes were actually brought through this picture. So if we took the picture today, you'd see the bike lanes here. So you can see that this used to be a 4-lane street, 2 lanes in each direction, and we're able to put in the median, the bike lanes, the center turn lane, and really change the feel and the look of the street. And of course, it still accommodates transit. You can see the bus pulled over there at the bus stop. So road diets and traffic operations, and this really gets into some of the nitty-gritty details that you always have to work out when you're looking at doing a road diet. First of all, I'll just talk a little bit about crashes and safety. And the question you see here is, what types of crash types can be reduced by going from 4 lanes to 3 lanes. So on the left side of your screen, you see a typical street, 2 lanes in each direction. Again, on the right side, typical road diet, you see 1 lane in each direction and the bike lanes, and you also see that we've added a car, left-turning car in that center lane. So that's again, your classic road diets. By the way, you'll notice that trees have been added on the right side too. Is that one of the great things that bike lanes can do is in some situations where there's a discomfort with putting in street trees because concerns about being too close to a travel lane. Sometimes when you put in a bike lane, it gives you permission then to add the street trees, which of course is a wonderful addition. And again, street trees change the feel and character of a street, and they begin to also add a value in terms of this is a place to expect bikes, pedestrians, slow down. It's a neighborhood. It's all about the messaging that a street gives. And just as an aside, but I think it's worth mentioning, we all know that streets have two speed limits, the one that people travel and the one that's posted. And in some cases, there's a huge gap in those two numbers, and in other cases there's not. And a lot of it has to do with the look and the feel of the street. So that's why, again, road diets are so important, because it really starts to change the messaging of a street in terms of what it conveys. It's not about changing the speed limit. It's not about people saying different speed limit signs posted. Those quite often have very little value, but changing the character of a street can significantly change the speed. That said, turn back to the crash types, and we'll go through three different crash types. If you look at the image on the left, you'll see the red car has its blinker on, and it's going to make a left turn. And so one of the common crash types that you're going to get on a typical four-lane road is you're going to have rear-end crashes. Now, this, of course, is going to vary a lot from road to road. If you're on a road that has very few driveways, and if it's not in a strip development area, for example, and you have very few left turns, then this will not be a very common crash type. However, if you're on a typical suburban street with a lot of driveways, fast food kinds of establishments, restaurants, other sorts of things, you get a lot of left-turning movement, you're going to get a fair number of rear-end crashes. And if you look over to the right, of course, you can see that the red car is turning left, and no one behind the red car to have that kind of a rear-end crash. So this is one typical kind of crash that's reduced from going from 4 lanes to 3 lanes. A second kind of crash that can be reduced is sideswipe. And we've all experienced this. We've probably all done this. Someone's turning left in front of you, so you switch lanes and move to the right. And again, I'm looking at the image on the left side, is you swerve to the right so that you can continue your trip and your momentum and not have to stop for that left-turning car. And, of course, that creates the possibility of then sideswiping or cutting in front of a car in that right lane. And we all know that cars have a blind spot, and so the more of this lane switching that you get, the more likely that from time to time you're going to have a sideswipe type crash. Again, looking at the image on the right side, you'll notice that there's no reason to switch lanes because the through traffic is already all contained within that right curb lane. There's a third kind of crash that can occur by going from be reduced, by going from 4 lanes to 3 lanes. If you look at the left, you'll see that the red car in the upper left is making a left turn. And you can look at the sight distance drawn in there, and there's 2 cars coming, one in each of the 2 travel lanes, and you can see how the sight distance is blocked, one car blocking the other. And so you look at the red car going, we'll just call it north, they're going up, is blocking the yellow car, which is going forward. Now, the red car that's sort of creating the sight distance problem, if that were a panel truck or a bus or a bigger vehicle, this kind of a problem becomes even more acute. I like to compare this to the multiple threat that we've all heard about with pedestrians crossing streets. We've known from different studies that people are frequently hit in that last lane if you have 4 lanes crossing a street, because the motor vehicles stop for pedestrians in the first 3 lanes and then get hit in that 4th lane because of this very issue, the sight distance issue, where the stop cars stopping for the pedestrian crossing the street then block the sight distance for that final car. So it's not all that different from motor vehicles. The same thing that pedestrians experience crossing the street, left-turning motor vehicles, which in a sense are crossing the street, experience that same kind of problem. Then, of course, if you go to the right panel, again, you'll see there's a center left turn lane, and so you really are only crossing 1 lane of traffic instead of 2 lanes of traffic when you're making that left turn when you're in a motor vehicle, and so your sight distance is much very much opened up, broader, and you're going to be able to see the oncoming traffic. One other thing that we don't always talk about, but I think is important in this too, is that when you're making a left turn over 2 lanes of moving traffic, you have to judge the closing speed of 2 vehicles. Let's assume that you can even see both vehicles, but more than likely they're going different speeds. And so when you're making that left turn, you've got to make a quick snap judgment as to the speed and the closing distance of those 2 motor vehicles. And it's hard to do, and it's even harder to do, of course, if you have 3 lanes. And when you are making a left turn and you only have to cross 1 lane, then it's much easier to determine whether you have enough time and space to make that left turn before that vehicle arrives. And again, this is very comparable to what happens with pedestrians when they're crossing the street, is that they're judging the speed and the closing distance for multiple lanes. And so if they have fewer lanes that they have to do this in, it's all the better. So again, some of the sort of basic rules of thumb of what causes crashes and how do we avoid them are really quite similar in some ways between motor vehicles and pedestrians. I'm going to go through a little case study here. This was in Edgewater Drive in Orlando, Florida. And I think it's a good example because it's pretty typical of the road diet kinds of projects that I'm familiar with and been involved in. And certainly, one case study doesn't tell the whole story. But I think in this case, it gives you an average of what we found when we're out in the community and we're doing these kinds of things. So I think it really does tell a good story that's probably pretty close to what's typical. In this case, this was the Florida State Department of Transportation. They had a project here to repave the street, and they were open to the 3-lane option if the city would take over jurisdiction of the street. And that's certainly something I've been familiar with, and I'm guessing other folks have experienced a similar situation where, urbanized street, there always comes up the issue of jurisdiction beyond it. But that's sort of a minor point here. But the Florida Department of Transportation was very open to this in this case, but they did say that if you do a road diet, you make changes, you need to involve the neighborhood, the business associations, and do some before and after studies. By the way, just as a side note, is that my experience has been that if you have not done a lot of road diets in a particular neighborhood or city, county, whatever, there's always concern from the businesses that, well, this is going to reduce traffic and therefore I'll have less business and it's going to hurt my business. And of course, and I'll show in a minute that usually it doesn't affect the average daily traffic. And in fact, it helps businesses because now it provides an opportunity to easily make that left turn. And I'm sure all of us have been in a situation like shown on the before here where you want to make a left turn, but it's pretty high-speed traffic. You have people right on your tail. You feel a little nervous about it because you don't want to get rear-ended. And so it's not the left turn is not something that you go out of your way to do or in any way just do routinely. You may just not make that left turn. And so what we find, and I really found this in Seattle to be interesting, is that there were cases where the concept of the road diet had worked so well in different communities that it actually flipped where people were saying, we want one. And sometimes even we want one of these in situations where they weren't totally appropriate. But the point being is that creating that left turn gives an opportunity for people to make the left turn into private parking lots and things where there are other businesses. So at the end of the day, it's frequently seen as something that really helps business because it makes it more accessible and safer. So here was the reality, just going back to the case study here in Orlando, Florida. Here was the before reality. And you can see again here, it was a standard road diet, 2 lanes in each direction. In this case, there was also existing parking. There was parking on both sides of the street. And this was what they ended up putting in, the reality after. And you can see in this particular part of the street system, a standard road diet. You can see the bike lane was put in, the center left turn lane, one lane in each direction, and the parking was kept. And that's a really important point to make, is that we, in most cases, don't take out the parking. In fact, I'll show you an example in a minute where we actually got additional parking in. If road diets are tied to taking out parking, that becomes a real problem politically quite often. So what we're really talking about is leaving the parking alone in most cases, and then doing some rechannelization with the lanes in the middle, but leaving the parking. So they did some studies, and again, we're just looking at this particular example, but I think it's typical of what you find in a lot of road diets is the crash rate went down. So before they did the road diet, and again, we're talking about this street right here, is there was one crash every 2.5 days, or 146 crashes per year along this corridor. There was a 34% reduction after they did the road diet. There were one crash every 4.2 days, or 87 crashes per year. And, you know, different road diets are obviously going to get different numbers, but I think it's typical to see crash reduction rates in the 30 percentile range, 30 to 40%. Sometimes it's a little lower, sometimes it's a little higher, but this is probably fairly typical. If you look at the injury rate, it goes down even more dramatically. One injury every 9 days to one injury every 30 days, 68% reduction. And this is kind of interesting, and again, this is pretty typical. What happens is, first of all, you have fewer injuries because, we'll look at this in a minute, is because the speed goes down. And so if you have lower speeds, when you do have a crash, you're going to have fewer and less severity of injuries. The other thing that changes, though, of course, is the kinds of crashes that occur. And you tend not to have those really terrible T-bone kind of crashes that you get when you're making a left turn and you go in front of somebody else, or even rear-end crashes. More of the crashes that you're going to see are going to be to the side swipe and some of those kinds of things, so that you not only get a reduction in crashes, but you get a pretty significant reduction in injury crashes. And most of the data that I've seen when you've looked at before and after road diets, before their diet and after, seems to validate the fact that the injury rates will go down actually a little more than strictly the crash rates. This is kind of interesting when you start looking at the speeding. And if you look at the left side here, just note that this is the percent of vehicles traveling over 36 miles an hour. Speed limit here is 35 miles an hour. And so they looked at 3 different sections of this corridor and got some of the changes in that reduction. Again, this is fairly typical. I think it's important to note here, though, that this is not average speed or median speed. This is just people who are going like over the speed limit. Now, one of the things, and I'll touch on this in a minute, a little bit more later, but one of the things that we know about road diets is that it really prevents, when you do a road diet, it stops the people who are doing the horrific speeding, causing the horrific crashes, from going really fast. So instead of being able to, in a 2-lane situation, if the speed limit is 35, you're going to get a few people who are going, 50, 55 in those areas. They're the ones that are causing the really bad crashes. So if you think of speed as a bell curve, and if you look at before and after a road diet, what you're doing is quite often preventing the really high-speed folks from going really fast. So now you only have one lane. And so that may not affect the average speed so much. In fact, it's not atypical to have a road diet and only reduce the average speed, say 2 to 4 miles an hour, 2 to 5 miles an hour, which may not sound like a lot. But if you really dig into the numbers, you find it's actually much more significant when you start looking at the outliers and the number of people, again, who are going really fast in these areas. So speed is a little tricky one, but you really get more value out of it than might first appear. Okay, traffic volumes. And this is kind of interesting, and I'm just going to spend a little bit of time here because this is something that comes up in just about every road diet project. In this particular case, they had about 20,000 vehicles per day. This is ADT. And initially, it went down to 18,100, and then slowly edged up to about 21,000. This little pattern is very typical. When you first do a road diet, quite often there's a worry that, whoops, it's going to be congested, I'll take another route, and then people soon discover that, whoops, this works really well, it's not a problem, they come back, and then it goes up to what it was before, if not even a little bit more sometimes, because it might actually work better. Talk just a little bit about the numbers. People always ask, well, what's the range? What works for a road diet and what doesn't? Before throwing out a couple numbers, what I'm going to just suggest here is a few things you want to look at because different roads are going to have different numbers for it's appropriate to do a road diet. A couple of rules of thumb. If you have a lot of left-turning movement, if you're in a very urbanized situation with a lot of left turns, short blocks, a signal at, like in a downtown or semi-downtown situation, a signal at every corner, then you can probably go quite a bit higher on a road diet. And in some situations, you can even go up to 24,000, 25,000 and still maintain that after the road diet if it's a very urbanized situation and you have a lot of left turn movement. On the other hand, if you're in a very suburban situation, and say you're going along a lake, or you're paralleling a railroad track, or you're paralleling a river, and there's virtually no left turn, then putting in a left turn lane could be silly because nobody's making a left turn, but it also could significantly change the capacity of that street. So I'm giving you on the other extreme in terms of the through lane. There is no left turn, and so if you take away a lane, it really could affect that capacity. So there's really a range, but in general, anything under 15,000, it doesn't matter the situation at all. If you have a 15,000 ADT, you're probably really safe doing a road diet. If you have even a moderate number of left turns and signals from time to time, and this is most streets, certainly going up to 20, 21,000 is going to be fine. And again, you can get up to 24, 25,000 in some situations. One word of caution, though, is when you do a road diet, you need to pay a lot of attention to the signalization. If you do a road diet and you don't address the signals at the same time, you could have some pretty massive backups, and the public reaction will be not there's a problem with a single signal, there's a problem with a road diet, and we need to get rid of it. It's the worst thing that ever happened. So when you start looking at the costs of a road diet and budgeting for it and thinking it through, sometimes actually the signalization work is going to cost you more than just doing the rechannelization on the paint, especially if you're doing the rechannelization as part of a repaving project. It may not be really any additional expense to rearrange the channelization. So what you really need to look at, and I can't stress this enough, is to look at the signals, look at the left turn movements, do your counts, do your analysis, see if you need to put in a left turn arrow, whatever needs to be done to really get the signal working so that your road diet doesn't backfire on you and you end up not being able to do the road diet because of that. So a few other things to look at. In this case, on-street parking went up. And what it really reflects is that people are more comfortable parking when you have a 3-lane section than a 4-lane section. Again, it's a character issue, it's a feel issue, traffic's a little bit slower, and it just gives a comfort level. So you don't always get this dramatic a change. I would say this is a little bit on the high end, but nonetheless, it's very typical for parking utilization to go up. And of course, when parking utilization goes up, It means that more people are shopping if it's a business area. But equally important is the messaging. If the parking is full, the messaging is this is a center. This is a center of activity. There's a lot going on here, and this is a good place to stop and do business. I always like to compare it to going to a town that you're a guest in, and you go out for dinner, and you go by a restaurant, and it's completely empty. And you're thinking, the locals know something, it's probably not too good. And you find another restaurant that's got a lot of people in it, and it's full. And as long as you don't have to wait more than 15 or 20 minutes, it might be a really good bet, because obviously the local folks know it's a good restaurant. And some of that same psychology applies to some of our neighborhood business areas, especially when it comes to parking. If you're messaging that there's parking here, and if that parking leads to more people on the street, leads to energy, your messaging is, this is the center, this is a good place to be, stop, even if it's hard to find a parking spot. You want to be here because this is where everyone else is. So, again, start making those links between road diets, parking utilization, energy, messaging, economic development. Looking a little bit at pedestrian volumes, here's some just before and after numbers, and a 23% increase. By the way, a couple of things, of reasons why the pedestrian use might go up, and I've hit on a couple of those already. Certainly, if you have more parking, you're going to have more people. Also, if you can add street furniture, street trees as part of the project, like I mentioned before, it becomes more pedestrian friendly. And then this is one of those hidden little treasures about bike lanes, is if you can put bike lanes in, that provides additional buffer between the pedestrian, we call it the pedestrian zone, or the sidewalk, and moving motor vehicle traffic. And if you're really going to get numbers like you see here for pedestrians, you really need some sort of buffer. And in this particular example we're looking at here in Florida, they had a double buffer. They had the parking and they had the bike lane. And so you really start bringing pedestrians away from that moving motor vehicle traffic. There's obviously some safety feeling there. Farther away, it's going to feel a lot safer. But also, you're going to be away from the noise, the exhaust. It's just going to be a much more pleasant walking experience. And, of course, when you get more people walking, that's more economic vitality. People shop, cars don't. And so, again, you start seeing that economic tie. Bicycle volumes. In this case, they had a 30% increase. They had a fair number of cyclists on the street beforehand, but it went up. This is very, very typical, and this is a very typical kind of jump. I would actually suggest that it might even be a little bit low. I think we're not going to get more than this in terms of a percent increase. But what it really does here is it highlights the fact, and this is what people have been telling us for years, is that the biggest barrier to more bicycling is fear of motor vehicle traffic. And when you put the bike lane in and you give bicyclists a space to be in, a dedicated space, people's comfort level goes up, and you get more people, the bike volumes go up. So I'm just going to go back to this real quick. I just want to circle back to the concept again of how we do counts, and do you count just the motor vehicles, or do you count the pedestrians, the bicyclists, and a slide I didn't add here would be, do you count the number of people in buses and transit, streetcar, whatever you may have on that street. And I think when you start looking at total street capacity, then the story we have to tell about road diets becomes even better. So looking at the study again, going back to our Orlando, Florida example, if we look at the effectiveness and did the restriping accomplish the objective? Avoid increasing traffic on neighborhood streets, yes. And that's something that always comes up as a worry. And to check that, I think is always important. It's something certainly that we've done in Seattle on quite a few of the road diets have been done here. And it's just something that doesn't happen with road diets. People stay on the street. Reduce speeding, we did that. Increase bicycle volumes, you saw the numbers on that. Same with increasing pedestrian volumes, reducing crashes, increase on-street parking, increase. These last two are a little fuzzy, but they're also really important, and these are things that you ask people in follow-up surveys. Did it increase sort of your overall satisfaction? Do you like it? Does it work for you? And the look and feel issues are so important, and they may be what drives ultimately transportation behavior. In some cases, more than just about anything else. Is it, again, is it inviting? Does it feel good? Are there people here? Is this where I really want to be, to spend my time, to do business, to live? And so those softer kinds of things should always be looked at, and they're really important. And I think usually you want to look at both people who live in the area, what's their satisfaction, and then, of course, you want to look at people who are coming into the area to the business, wherever the case may be. Both very, very important. So here's just a little drawing on the top. And what it demonstrates is that on the upper left, if you have two lanes in each direction, you can always pass. And so you see the yellow dot there representing a car, and the red dot easily passing and allowing that red dot to go really at high speed. Example on the right, you see the four dots representing four motor vehicles, and the yellow dot, in other words, the prudent driver, sets the speed. Now, one thing, of course, that could happen is people use the center turning lane as a passing lane, and that can happen. It does happen, and that's why quite often when you do a road diet, you go from the 4-lane to the 3-lane, you really want to build in some median crossing islands and space them where they'll do two things. One is they'll provide a crossing island for the pedestrians, but they also then break up that line of vision and prevent people from using that center turn lane as a passing lane. Of course, there's a lot of things you can do in that center turn lane. In addition to doing just spot crossings, you can put in sections of median. So obviously that's controversial sometimes because it prevents left-turning movements into businesses, and so that's almost a separate topic, an access management issue in itself. Well, I guess the only political caution here is don't let the median issue destroy your opportunity to do a road diet. In other words, don't let the median become the issue. You can always come back and do a median later if the median is going to be controversial. So quite often a good strategy is to break up that center turn lane with a series of crossing islands, and I'll talk in a minute about some of the advantages to pedestrians, but without going to a full median. So again, there are many opportunities where maybe you don't need that center turn lane, and then a median is perfectly fine. So again, that's going to vary by situation. So you look at the questions below here. We've already covered this. Which one carries more traffic? The answer is, it depends on the situation. In most cases, again, if it's 20,000 ADT or less, you're going to be able to maintain the same amount of traffic. We talked about speeds. We talked about the ability to pass others. We talked about crash rates. And we've also talked about bicyclists, pedestrians, and businesses. So if you going away from the example and just going sort of to the national average, and there's been some studies done, and there'll be more studies coming out in the future, is looking at it as, in general, you can expect close to a 30% overall crash reduction factor in terms of doing this. And for those of you who follow the CRF, the crash reduction factor, and you look at all the different tools that are available to us in terms of reducing crashes, and there's at least 50 or 60 standard traffic operation tools that we have to reduce crashes, you'll know that getting close to 30% is a really high number in terms of effectiveness of a particular treatment. So what are some of the benefits of road diets for pedestrians? And I just want to spend a little bit of time here again because, again, like I mentioned in my opening remarks, quite often they're driven by a need or a desire to do something for a cyclist, but increasingly I'm seeing road diets done because they really benefit pedestrians as well. One of the nice things about this, of course, is that everyone's a pedestrian. So you have in a sense, a bigger audience to support this, if you will, when you start looking at some of the things it does for pedestrians. It reduces the crossing distance. And we know that there's a relationship between the crossing distance and the number of crashes that you're going to have involving pedestrians when you're crossing the street. It eliminates or reduces the multiple threat. I touched on that earlier when I was talking about motor vehicles having a multiple threat when they were crossing two lanes. Well, in this case, we're reducing the multiple threat for pedestrians because you cross one lane, and then assuming well, even if you don't put in a crossing island, you're only crossing 3 lanes instead of 4 lanes. Now, if you go to the next point and you actually install a crossing island, then you're only crossing 1 lane at a time. And we know that there's a pretty strong relationship between the number of lanes, the crossing distance, and the number of pedestrian crashes that one might expect. And almost always, crossing the 1 lane of traffic is going to be very safe. And so adding the crossing island allows you to cross the street in 2 steps with the crossing island serving in the middle where you can cross, stop, look, cross again. You don't have to cross the street in all one movement. Again, some of the advantages for pedestrians I mentioned before, it reduces top-end travel speeds. And again, if you're a pedestrian and you're hit by a high-speed car, the results just simply, the numbers aren't very good in terms of survival. And so a huge advantage here for pedestrians. Mention the next one too, buffered sidewalks and travel lanes. And again, an example we saw is it had a double buffer. It had the parking and the bike lane. And again, quite often that then gives you permission to add street trees. So a whole bunch of advantages. And then the final one, reclaim the street space for higher and better use than just moving peak hour traffic. So, even if there is a little bit of a downside for a half hour or so, maybe an hour for peak hour use, even though quite often there's not, but even if there is, the street is really operating better for everyone the other 23 and a half hours a day. So, the higher and better use, I think, is a concept that really needs to be thought about and discussed when contemplating doing a road diet. So just a couple other examples, and then we'll wrap this up. This is just an example of reclaiming street space for installing a pedestrian island. And in this particular example, right where that car is there on the right side, there was a demand there for pedestrians crossing the street. And one of the challenges there, of course, is that you can see the slight curve. And so it wasn't always as easy to see oncoming cars, and yet the pedestrians were there. And so you go to the next image, and this was the concept that was proposed. And you can see adding a crossing island and adding the bike lanes, a standard road diet, 4-lane to 3-lane. And what this did, of course, is that it added the bike lanes, the buffer, but more importantly in this case probably is for the pedestrians that allowed them to cross 1 lane, go to the center crossing island, and then cross the other lane. And of course, once you're, say you're crossing from the right side to the left side, is once you cross that first lane and go to the crossing island, now your sight distance is opened up quite a bit, and you can see the oncoming traffic. So a crossing island can also be a tool to address sight distance issues if that happens to be the situation. Now here's the reality. This is what was put in, and you can see it worked very, very well, solved the problem. Again, you can see that it reduced the exposure time, the crossing distance. Again, exposure time being the time that a pedestrian is in the street right away where you expect motor vehicles and has that exposure. I'm just going to show a couple more examples here. This one I really like, and I would encourage you just to look at this really closely for a minute, because I'm going to show you the before and after. And in terms of looking at this, so just describing this, this is really a wide street. It has 2 lanes in each direction, center turn lane, plus parking. So a really wide street, and here's the next image. And by the way, this was repaved, so you can see some of the changes. So it went from 2 lanes in each direction to 1 lane in each direction with a center turn lane, and we're able to add the bike lanes, and the parking on the right side changed. But on the left side, and this is what's really unique, is that they added back-in angle parking. And just a few comments about back-in angle parking and some of the advantages. First of all, when you have back-in angle parking, it means that you can put in a bike lane and be comfortable about it, because people who are coming out of the parking spot can see the oncoming cyclist. So there's a huge advantage for the cyclist. But it also has a lot of other advantages. First of all, with regard to crashes, most people, or not most, but a lot of people are not very good at backing out. We'll just sort of start there. And you can think of it as you have 2 choices. If you have traditional head-in angle parking, you have somebody backing out into motor vehicle traffic that they can't see quite often, especially if you park next to, say, again, a panel truck or a big van or something. So you're backing out, and if you have a crash, you're having a moving vehicle hitting a moving vehicle, both with people in it, and you're likely to have an injury. If you're backing into one of these spaces and you happen to hit a parked car, then you're hitting a car that's not moving and most likely has nobody in it. And so even if you do have a crash, it won't be an injury crash. But there's a bunch of other advantages here, too. Think of kids. When you have back and angle parking, you open the doors. The only way the kids can go is to the sidewalk. If you have head-in parking, you open the doors, and especially if you have a parked car on each side of you, the only way the kids can go is into the street. Another big advantage is loading. If you have a trunk, hatchback, whatever the case may be, you're now facing the sidewalk. And so you can load your car from the sidewalk as opposed to having to walk out into the street and load the back end of the car from the street. There's obviously some design issues you have to address. When you back in, you're going to get a little more of an overhang typically, and so you got to make sure that you don't bump into signs. You may need to move signs. You have to make sure you don't run into the street trees, again, because you have a little more of an overhang. You certainly need to look at that. People always raise the issue of, how do you teach people to do this? It's going to be really hard. And I can tell you from experience that it's not that hard. Once you do the striping, you simply put some cars parked correctly out there. And then the first day or two that you are doing this, you have a couple of safety ambassadors out there, maybe all dressed in white or something like that, something to really identify them, or maybe with orange safety vests, and you just answer questions and help people do it. But the learning curve on these, in my experience, has been really fast, as opposed to some other things that are a challenge in terms of a learning curve, but these seem to work very, very well. And then finally, there's a lot of potential on one-way streets. Back in the 50s, 60s, a lot of our, especially downtown areas, were turned into two-way couplets. And just as an aside, and because it really increases the capacity of the street, just as an aside, what it did, of course, is the intention was to really facilitate movement of motor vehicles and get the level of service up. And, of course, it accomplished just that. It made it easy for people to all leave town, and, in fact, they did. And we ended up with a lot of dead downtown areas. And the whole notion of creating all one-way streets, synchronizing the signals, and helping people get out of town as fast as possible, again, is really messaging is that our town is not where you want to be. In fact, we're going to do everything possible to help you leave town as quickly as possible. And so that's why you're seeing a lot of movement toward reestablishing two-way streets in a lot of the downtown areas, because you want to really create the notion is when you're in our neighborhood commercial area or downtown area, whatever the case may be, you're at the center of the world. You don't need to leave quickly because you've arrived. This is a destination. So again, that psychology of streets becomes so important when it comes to economic development. But I digress. Just going back to this is that when we do have a one-way streets, very frequently there's excess capacity. In this case, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lanes plus parking. And so there really is an opportunity to take one of those lanes and turn it into a bike lane. Quite often you can actually take a whole lane and do a buffered bike lane, for example, and put in, say, a 5-foot hashed area and still have like a 6-foot bike lane. So you can really do some nice things on these one-way streets that have excess capacity. This just shows an example. This is a one-way street, and you can see here that the bike lane was put in, works very, very well. And you also notice here, and it's not really the topic of the discussion, but it's in the picture, so I'm going to mention it. You'll notice the bulb out. And for businesses, one of the nice things that a bulb out does is it means that that parking is there permanently. It can never be taken away because you can't use it as a travel lane. So it guarantees that parking. And then, of course, the other nice thing about a bulb out is that it allows pedestrians to see around parked cars, and it allows motor vehicle drivers to see the pedestrians. And they're going to be particularly valuable at non-signalized locations where there's no positive traffic control, because then you really need to see around the parked cars. And, of course, it reduces, again, that crossing distance, that exposure time. So it has a lot of benefits for pedestrians, but also for bicyclists. So you can see this has become a very pleasant street by simply doing some rechannelization. One of the things I like to say is paint is your friend, and because you can accomplish so much with paint in terms of really changing the character of the street. As they did in this case, did a road diet and were able to put in the bike lane. So just in conclusion, hopefully now you'll be able to describe how pedestrian crash risks increase with the number of travel lanes and speed, explain why reducing the number of travel lanes reduces risk and makes it easier to cross the street, demonstrates how reducing lanes frees space for higher and better use, and also the notion that we shouldn't be building to peak traffic. By the way, I might add to that is also special event peak traffic, like building to say you don't have 6 or 7 football games around a particular stadium a year, and building the whole street system to accommodate it. It usually doesn't make that much difference because you're going to have police officers and traffic control folks out there directing the traffic anyway. It's a completely different situation. So again, look at highest and best use. And with that, I will open it up to questions.
All right. Thank you, Peter. We now have some time for questions. Please enter your questions into the box on your screen. Again, if we run out of time for your question, we'll attempt to answer it and get back to you after the program. All right. Peter, our first question asks, how can you drive home the point that more lanes equals increased risk for non-drivers? This seems to be a hard concept to get design resources assigned to. What resources can you point them to?
Sure. If I understand the question correctly, is what resources can we sort of prove that having more lanes is a threat, especially to pedestrians? And I would refer you there to what's commonly called the Gear study, and this was done through the University of North Carolina's Highway Safety Research Center, published by the Federal Highway Administration, and also published by TRB and ITE. And it was a study that looked at 1,000 locations where there were marked crosswalks at uncontrolled locations, and it looked at 1,000 locations where the crosswalks were not marked, but there was a crosswalk there. What came out of that study is that there's 3 significant factors when you start looking at pedestrian safety. One is going to be the number of lanes in terms of the lanes that you have to cross. The other is ADT, the average daily traffic. And then third, though a little behind those 2, was speed. And it's real clear those are those 3 factors. And I would point people to that study.
All right. Thank you, Peter. We're going to move on to our next question. The next question says, I need to see how bulb outs I need to see how bulb outs that benefit pets can be designed to please cyclists. And I have a traffic engineer who won't install fog lights without painting a center line on a neighborhood collector, thus eliminating the benefit of the narrower travel way. Do you have any ideas for these issues?
Yeah, I may need to have you repeat the second part, but the first part, in terms of conflict with bicycles, it's real important whenever you do a bulb out is that you don't go any more than about 6 feet, because most, and also too, obviously you can only do bulb outs where there's parking. You can't do it into a travel lane. Most parking lanes are 7 or 8 feet wide, and so if you do the bulb out to 6 feet, you're not going to interfere with the cyclist. If you go more than 6 feet, it could be a problem. A couple other things on the design of bulb outs. One of the issues that always comes up is maintenance and, street sweeping, that kind of thing. And one of the things I always encourage communities to do is look at what kind of street sweepers you have or snowplows, what's the curb radius they have, the turning radius, and then design your bulbs so that the machinery you have can be used with those bulbs and that you don't need special hand sweeping or hand shoveling. And it could even lead to a change in the kind of equipment you buy so that you buy equipment that's more versatile and can make tighter turns and things like that. So it's really, this is one of those areas where you really need to have a good discussion and collaboration between people doing the design and people doing the maintenance. A last comment I guess I would make about bulbs is if you want to be smart about where you put them, and I alluded to this a little earlier, is that they're going to be of most value at locations where there's no positive traffic control, maybe a marked crosswalk, and it's going to be where you're going to have a lot of pedestrians.
Okay, thank you, Peter. And it looks like we may have had some audio issues on that question, so we'll make sure we get that one posted after the program. We're going to move on to the next question. What are the steps for implementing road diets? Does a road diet require an EIR, traffic impact analysis, and or general plan amendment?
That's a good question, and I'm going to have to answer that by saying it depends. It's really going to depend on local regulations, state regulations, who owns the road, is it a county road, a city road, a state road, and they're all going to have different requirements in terms of what kind of study and analysis you need to do. So it's going to be nothing to sometimes you need to do something. So that's about as best I can answer that question because it's really going to vary community to community.
Okay. Thank you. The next question looks like refers to slide 7.9. It says on slide 7.9 regarding left turn / broadside crash type, a bicyclist in the bike lane is still shaded by a vehicle in the adjacent travel lane. Are you saying that it is not okay to expose motorists to broadside crashes, but okay to expose bicyclists to the same crash type?
That's a good question. What I'm suggesting here is that when you only have one motor vehicle lane, and it's a good question because I didn't really cover that, is when you have only one motor vehicle lane is that the turning vehicle, this would be on the right side there, from that center turn lane, the turning motor vehicle is going to be much more likely to see the bicyclist if there's only one motor vehicle lane versus two. So if you had two lanes, as shown on the left side of the screen, and say we pop the bicyclist into that situation, the ability to see that bicyclist will be diminished. So it's a good question. So you go to the right side, and it's much more likely that the turning vehicle will see the cyclist because there's less opportunity for the cyclist to be blocked by one lane of traffic than two lanes of traffic.
Okay. The next question asks, in the Edgewater case study, what if the parked car opens the door that encounters ongoing bicycle traffic?
Yeah, I'll move up here and go to that. That's a good question. Let's see. I went the wrong way. Sorry about that. This is a good one right here. Is one of the things that I think is important is when you do put in bike lanes that are next to parked cars, is that the bike lanes, there's two things. One is that they be at least 5 feet wide, and then the second is, and you can see this on the right here, is that you use 2 paint stripes. You'll notice there's a paint stripe defining the parking area on the right, and then there's a second stripe defining the bike lane. And again, what that parking stripe does is it gives some people something to work off of, so that it makes it easier for them to tuck up against the curb, and it really means that they're not going to be out in that bike lane. So when they do open the door, they're not going to catch the cyclist. So usually what I recommend is that parking lane be at least 4 inches wide, and then the other one near the travel lane should be 6 inches wide, so that it really stands out. And of course, the lanes by the parking are going to last a long time because they don't get that much use. They're going to last probably several years, whereas the other lane is going to wear quicker. And I just mentioned that because in all these things you do want to think about maintenance. So I think there's some things that we're building into the design of the bike lanes that begins to minimize the car door issue. Obviously, if you have more space, sometimes you have the opportunity to actually put a bit of a buffer between the parked cars and the bike lane. You could do a 2-foot hashed area, 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot, whatever the case, whatever space you have available. And that's another design option you have.
Okay, great. We have about 20 more minutes for questions, but I do want to remind everybody that we will be posting the questions after the program. We have received a large amount of questions, so we'll get to as many as we can in the next 20 minutes. The next question says, I'm curious if there have been situations where some of the road width was moved from pavement to sidewalk. In many cases, a narrow sidewalk is the greatest lag.
Yeah, I guess I would respond by saying, has it ever happened? Of course it happens. And when you do have excess capacity, I think including in the discussion should be a widening of sidewalks. And that may indeed be the very best solution. The one challenge, of course, with widening sidewalks is that it can be fairly expensive, not just widening the sidewalk, but if you have to move the drainage, move all the inlets, obviously you're into a lot more capital costs. But there are situations where that's exactly the right thing you want to do.
Okay. The next question asks, is the crash reduction rate in all crashes or only of the type you identify as being minimized by crash diets?
If I understand the question correctly, obviously there's a lot of different kinds of crashes, and what the presentation did is it selected the 3 most common types, the 3 that are the most common type of crash, and the 3 that are most likely to be reduced. But, yeah, of course, you're still going to have a host of other different kinds of crash types on any street, and you would find these before and after on road diet streets as well. It's just that they weren't statistically as robust as the 3 examples I gave.
Okay, we're going to move on to the next question. What is the overall cost per mile of a road diet that converts a 4-lane to a 3-lane road and has bicycle lanes and on-street parking? Really looking for the materials cost for these types of changes.
That's a good question, a tough question, and I'll address it the best I can. Starting out by saying, of course, it depends. If you're repaving a street, like in the example in Orlando, Florida that I gave, and you're just talking about putting paint back, and you have a blank canvas to work on, so to speak, because you have a new roadway, then the cost of the paint itself is not going to be any different. It's pretty much a wash. It might actually be a little bit cheaper because if you have fewer lanes, you may not have quite as many white stripes to do. So in that case. Now, if you have an existing road and you want to do a road diet on it, you're not repaving it, and say you make a decision to go out, and I've done this with a grinder, and take it off and then add the new paint, obviously, that's going to be more expensive. I've seen some of those go up to, $20,000 to $30,000 a mile, something like that. It's going to vary a lot community to community, but that could be a range that it's in. The one thing though that again I would caution on is the biggest costs and the biggest drivers on this are going to be the signals. So if you have a corridor with a lot of signals, and if you need to spend a lot of money upgrading the signals, then all of a sudden you could be easily in anywhere from, $10,000 to $80,000 a pop to upgrade a signal, or even more sometimes. So it depends what you're doing. So that's probably where you're going to have more of your cost if you're doing a standard road diet, is really looking at your signals as much as just redoing the paint. So, it can range from being cheaper, really no cost, to, some real dollars as it gets up there. The one thing I always encourage people to do too, though, is to, think of what you're getting for the money. If you get, say, a mile of bike lane, and you reduce the crashes, and you create better pedestrian crossings, reduce those pedestrian crashes, and then you say, and say it costs you $30,000. If you compare that, say, for example, to building a mile of trail, where you're going to spend more than $1 million quite often now for a mile of trail in an urbanized situation, not at all suggesting don't do trails. Very big trail advocate and have built a lot. What I am suggesting is in a relative sort of sense, again, for painting's your friend, it's relatively cheap for the great value you get out of it.
Okay. The next question asks, with the possible increase in ADT after a road diet is implemented, did the peak hour increase to several hours?
That's a good question. None of the road diets that I've been familiar with has that happened because of the road diet. Because if the average daily traffic stays about the same, if you're looking at the peak hour, it does have the potential to, I would agree, to stretch it out a little bit, but certainly that's not something that I've seen much of.
Okay, and I believe you may have touched on the next question, but it says slide 717 shows the parking utilization increases with a road diet. Is that a good thing for bicyclists if the bike lane is within reach of open car doors?
Yeah, again, that's a good question. And I think in general it's good for bikes in this sense of the word. If you have an area that allows parking, but it's spotty, it kind of comes and goes, quite often what you're going to end up seeing is a pressure for cyclists not to go in a straight line, and to, where there is the parking, be out more in the street, and then the parking pit goes away for 150 feet or something, and all of a sudden you pull over to the curb because cars think you should move over because, they want to get around you, say, and then you go back and forth, and it's really that back and forth that is something you really want to avoid. And, one of the principles of vehicular cycling is that you really want to queue in a straight line and be very, very predictable. And when you have really spotty parking, that predictability sometimes can go away. So I think the added parking certainly helps address that issue. You're much more likely to go in a straight line. But probably even more to the point is, again, looking at the overall messaging of the street. And when you have a lot of parking, you have a lot of pedestrians, the overall messaging of the street is not only go slower, but expect to see bicyclists and pedestrians. When drivers are interviewed who have just hit a bicyclist, just hit a pedestrian, almost always they will tell you, I didn't see the bicyclist, I didn't see the pedestrian. And I think very often that's an honest answer because and they didn't see the bicyclist or the pedestrian because they were not expecting to see a bicyclist or pedestrian. When you start changing the whole environment of a street so that there's almost always bicyclists and pedestrians there because those uses go way up when you do a road diet, motorists are going to be looking for bicyclists and pedestrians. And so they're going to see them. When they see them, you're going to have lower crash rates. I always, when people honk at cyclists, I say, well, at least they saw you. They're complaining. It's the motor vehicle that don't see you that you really have to worry about. And so in terms of the overall messaging of a street, I think parking can, not in every situation, but in many situations, can be really positive for cyclists.
Okay. The next question asks, have you noted a significant impact to the remaining driving lane in terms of delays of accidents due to the cars that are pulling in and out of parking spots, especially given the increase in parking use?
Yeah, that's something I have not seen any studies on the crashes related to people parking, going in and out. That's a good question, and that would be something interesting to research.
Okay. Let's see. The next question asks, and it's a little long. It says, I am getting several questions from localities that have TWLTLs with or without road diets. They want to know what is the best and safest treatment at a grade crossing with lights and gates. Many want to install left-hand flashes and gates in the median area, but don't know how best to safely transition from TWLTL to a raised median section to a safely shielded grade crossing warning device in the median. What has been your experience with this subject?
Wow. That's I'm not sure I really picked up all the pieces of that question, but they're talking about two-way left turn lanes and medians and creating pedestrian crossings. And if I heard that correctly, quite often you can have a center turn lane, two-way turn lane, and still have two lanes in each direction, and you want to create a pedestrian crossing. Again, what the general recommendation there, of course, is that first of all, you do need a crossing island. You can't think of a unprotected two-way left turn lane as being a crossing island. You need that protection that you get from a median-type crossing island. Going back, though, to the principles of, let's assuming we're creating a pedestrian crossing in this kind of 5-lane section, is go back to the principles that I mentioned earlier with the gear study, is if you put in a crossing island, then you have the opportunity to, in effect, create two streets. You cross 2 lanes, crossing island, cross 2 lanes. And then the question becomes, can you put a marked crosswalk there at an uncontrolled location? And the answer, of course, it depends. You need to look at, again, average daily traffic. You have the 2 lanes, which is not as good as 1, but it still isn't 4, so it's not bad. And then you want to look at speed. And then there's pretty good guidance in this study to determine whether a particular location would be a good place to install a marked crosswalk, or whether a marked crosswalk could be installed, but maybe you need, additional, some additional things that you want to add to it in terms of, say, a rapid flash, or the new Hawk signal that we have available to us. Advanced signing, or if there's parking, adding bulb outs, whatever the case may be. But there's a whole host of traffic treatments that you can then add to make it a safer crossing. But it really comes down to, in a situation like that, is on a case-by-case basis, you need to look at what's going on.
Okay, we're going to move on to the next question. And Peter, if you don't, we can definitely make sure we get it posted. Do you happen to have a link for the Zagier study?
What I would recommend people do is go to the Highway Safety Research Center's website, or the National Center for Bicycling, or the PBIC, Pedestrian Bicycle Information Center, I'm sorry. And if just type in walkinginfo.org and then go to research, and you'll have it.
Great. Thank you, Peter. The next question asks, will bike volumes increase even without the addition of bike lanes?
They can in some situations, absolutely. I've certainly seen streets where maybe you had one lane in each direction and parking on both sides, and it's really highly urbanized, and the average speed limits are 10, 12 miles an hour, right about the average speed of a bicyclist. And cyclists in those situations just take the whole lane, say it's a narrow lane, and there's very little speed differential between the bicyclists and the motorists, and it can work really well together simply because of that lack of speed differential. And so not every situation demands a bike lane.
Okay. Are there any crash types that increase in frequency with a road diet?
I'm not familiar with any, no.
All right. The next question. With the reduction of through traffic lanes and installation of left turn lanes, bike lanes, and parking lanes, what is the minimum width of all types of new lanes installed?
Well, I mentioned earlier that parking lanes typically are 8 feet, especially if you have like a commercial area where you have some bigger vehicles. You certainly go down to 7 feet if it's like a neighborhood residential street where you're not having the panel trucks and the delivery trucks and also not as much turnover. The minimum you want for a bike lane is going to be 5 feet, especially if there's parking. It's certainly, you can go to 6 feet with the parking. It works really well. If you go much more than that, then you always have to have some concern that the bike lane might be used as a travel lane. Though there are situations where there's just so many cyclists that have something wider is okay. In terms of travel lanes, the widths, that's a really good question, because one of the things that we have not talked about today, and we're not going to get into in real detail, is something new. The corollary to road diet is lane diet. Quite often, lanes are wider than they need to be, and there's really an opportunity to narrow lanes as a way of either getting wide curb lanes for cyclists or getting a space for a bike lane for bicyclists. So, for the minimum widths that you need for different kinds of streets, curb lane, inside lane, certainly AASHTO, the Green Book, provides some really good guidance on that. What's interesting is there's a lot. And this is one of those things I think maybe there's some surprise at some time, is that there's a lot more flexibility when it comes to lane width than is practiced in a lot of areas of the country. What AASHTO does is it gives you a range, and it gives you a pretty good range in terms of a little wider, a little narrower, and a lot of times state and local governments will take the maximum widths and make that their standard. And you don't have to do that. And you really have a lot more flexibility than you might think. Also, there's some new studies that have been coming out that show that you can have narrower lanes and not have increases in the number of crashes and those kinds of things. Having said that, just getting back to lane widths, just a couple general comments. First of all, it depends on the street. Obviously, you're going to have a wider lane if it's, you probably want to have a minimum, say, the curbside lane of 11 feet minimum if it's a truck route, major truck route, or say it's a major bus route. If it's a neighborhood collector and you don't have a lot of those kinds of uses, certainly you can go down to 10 feet. The same thing could be said for the inside lane. Usually the inside lanes can be a little bit narrower than the outside lane. And then the same thing for the center turn lane. If you're on a major truck route and every truck is turning left, you're going to want to have it a little wider. You might want it 12 or 13 feet. There's many cases, though, that going down to 11 or 10 feet, if it's, say, a left turn into a residential area, might work just fine. And so, yeah, I guess I would leave it here to note that it depends, and there's a lot of flexibility, and really suggest to folks to get up to speed on the guidance that's available.
Okay, the next question asks, would you recommend a different evaluation matrix for residential neighborhoods?
Well, first of all, most residential streets, or I'll call them non-arterial streets, don't have channelization paint on them. In other words, they don't have a yellow center line or white channelization line. So that kind of, if it's a truly residential street in that sense, then yeah, you're going to have completely different guidelines, because you typically are not going to put bike lanes on a residential street because it doesn't have that kind of channelization. Certainly a tool that's available on residential streets are the new shared lane markings that are in the new 2009 METCD, and those certainly are a good option on a lot of residential streets. Now, if you go up from there, and that's sort of the hierarchy of streets, and you start talking about neighborhood collectors, streets that do have a center line and may have some channelization, yeah, of course you have the option there of putting in bike lanes if it makes sense to do so. And yeah, the guidelines, what you would want, would change a little bit. I already mentioned that on a neighborhood street, quite often you can go with a 7-foot parking lane instead of an 8-foot parking lane. You might be able to go with a 10-foot travel lane as opposed to an 11 or 12-foot travel lane. So yeah, I think it does. There's some flexibility in there, and you do need to look at adjacent land use and what's going on in the neighborhood.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for discussion today. If we did not get to your questions today, we will be addressing all of the submitted questions and posting them to the webinar page on our website. Once again, a recording and transcript of today's program, as well as a view of the PDF slide presentation, will be available in about a week at walkinginfo.org/webinars. Finally, I want to remind you that a very brief survey will appear once the webinar has ended. And again, we very much appreciate you taking out the time to complete it. I want to thank Peter today for his presentation, and thank all of you for attending today's PBIC and Federal Highway Administration Designing for Pedestrian Safety webinar. Once again, if you do need to access the archive of the presentation, will be available in about a week. You will also receive a follow-up email that includes the link for 1.5 hours of instruction. Thank you, Peter, and everyone have a great day.
Well, thank you.